Now, chapter 15 of Theologico-Political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza. This chapter, he contrasts reason and theology, which I found to be very interesting, like basically philosophy and faith. And he takes a very interesting approach to this, because here is the question that people have dealt with for thousands of years, especially in the period that Christianity has been around, maybe other religion like Islam. And the question is this: should reason or philosophy be subservient to theology, or theology to reason? Which should be above which? Should philosophy be above theology, or theology above philosophy? Or in other words, should the meaning of scripture be made to agree with reason, or should reason be made to agree with scripture? Which is basically, should we try to align scripture with science, or should we try to align science with religion, with scripture, sorry. And for some people this might sound like obvious. For example, if you talk of should we align science with scripture, then it's like, no, we can't do that. For some people it's so obvious, but it's not that clear when you think of other aspects of that question. And especially now when you talk of philosophy, let's forget about science, because science can be like hard, it's so clear. But when you start now talking of philosophy, where people reason and try to interrogate concepts and ideas and try to seek the truth, now theology can find it so easy to be like, oh, we can control the freedom of thinking, that is, and expression. But at the same time, there are philosophers who will be like, if the religion does not make sense in some aspect, we have to force it to make sense. And in fact, when you read this chapter, you realize like he is writing again to counter what Maimonides teaches, because Maimonides is basically, when you read his books, especially the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides is basically trying to find a way to make the Bible make sense or aligned to scientific discovery. Like if we discover that this is how the world works through scientific research, then Maimonides kind of like, his approach is like, then we go back to the Bible, and not being, we don't approach the Bible by trying to think that maybe the Bible is wrong. For example, let's talk of I think it's Joshua who says that the sun stood as they were fighting. I think Israel was fighting one of the enemies. Then and there was a way he explains it, which makes you assume or think the Joshua assumed that the earth went, the sun went around the earth, which is the other way around. Many years later on, thousands of years, we come to discover, oh, the earth goes around the sun. Now, the Maimonides' approach to such kind of an issue or question in the Bible is try to read that text and try to find a different meaning, like trying to avoid acknowledging that there is an error there, there's an error of understanding. So Baruch says, and I've said this many times, Baruch says thinks that's a wrong approach. And now when it comes to this question, should we have philosophy above theology or theology above philosophy, he takes a middle road, which I found to be so interesting. He takes a middle road, and I'm going to explain. So the middle ground he chooses is this. He tries to explain to us that trying to decide whether it's theology that should be above philosophy or philosophy as above theology is like we are doing apple-orange thing. Like we are comparing things that shouldn't be compared. In fact, they shouldn't be even thought of as mutually exclusive. And in fact, he says these two should be handled as two different things that can coexist nevertheless, that theology should have nothing to do with philosophy, and philosophy should have nothing to do with theology. He says the danger of trying to use philosophy or reason like it should be above theology. The problem with that is that then we are going to miss to interpret the Bible the way it should be interpreted, because now we are looking at philosophy and we are like, oh, when I read this text in the Bible, it doesn't make sense. I go back to theology, to philosophy, or science, and then try to make that text make sense, which is what Maimonides does. On the other hand, if theology is left to be above philosophy, then there is going to be a problem, because now theology is going to force philosophy not to discover, not to explore ideas, because now it's going to shut down any further interrogation of life and reality, which is a problem that societies have had, where in the they call the dark years or the dark ages, people will not think of anything that is outside the Bible. And because of that, Europe in particular stagnated when it comes to discovery and science, because people are now told like everything is in the Bible. Anything else you think outside the Bible, you are going where you are not supposed to go, and that became a problem. So both sides, Spinoza argues there is a problem. If theology is above philosophy, there is that problem of limiting discovery. If we put philosophy to be above theology, then we have this problem of not engaging with Scripture in a way that is more like we are trying to make, we are going to miss what the Scripture says because we will be working so hard to try to make Scripture fit what we think it should be, rather than just accepting it for what it is, and accepting that whatever we read in the Bible, that's how the people who wrote it saw the world and life around them. So we shouldn't try to revise that. We should just understand it from that angle. Like it takes the middle ground. Basically, he doesn't agree that philosophy should be above theology, and he doesn't agree that theology should be above philosophy, and he thinks the two can coexist but separately. And I was reading that part, and I was thinking of I think it's Jordan Peterson, the Canadian clinical psychologist. He's written a book, 12 Rules to Life, and I think I was watching an interview. Somebody was interviewing him, and there was this question of his belief in God, and his response to, because he's a scientist, and the interviewer was wondering how he can make the two, match the two, basically. And reading this book, I think that's the approach he was taking, even though it wasn't very clear to me at that point. But reading, I'm like, okay, I see where maybe he was coming from.